On December 20th, 1860, a group of South Carolina secessionists set off a chain of events that ultimately resulted in the deaths of 620,000 American soldiers during 4 years of bloody Civil War. This presentation outlines the cause of the war from source documents of the men who lived during that time and made the decisions which led to the conflict. The unique aspect of this presentation is utilizing the truth of God's Word to shed light on the reason why the war was fought and God's purpose for America by allowing the war. By the start of 1864, General Ulysses S. Grant had risen from obscurity to the status of national hero. In March 1864, General Grant was promoted to lieutenant general and given command of all of the Union armies. Grant decided to make his headquarters in the field by traveling with the Army of the Potomac. Though General Meade was still technically in command, General Grant would be formulating the battle strategy. His opponent in the Eastern Theater would be General Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. The first major battle between these armies would take place on May 5th and 6th, 1864. Grant's army consisted of 118,000 men with 61,000 soldiers in Lee's army. It was the bloody 2-day Battle of the Wilderness, with combined casualties of over 25,000. The Federal Army suffered twice as many casualties as the Confederates, but Grant was undeterred. In past battles in the East, when faced with this situation, the commanders of the Army of the Potomac would have retreated, but not Grant. On May 7th, Grant ordered his troops to continue marching south, and the soldiers were both surprised and delighted with their new commander. Both armies moved south and collided again at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. This battle lasted from May 8th through 19th, 1864. At this stage of the war, both sides used earthworks and entrenchments as defensive strategies, and this battle became a testimony of brutal hand-to-hand fighting. General John Sedgwick, a Federal Corps commander, attempted to calm his troops while fired upon by Confederate sharpshooters. He told his nervous soldiers,
"Don't duck. They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance."
A few moments later, a rebel bullet struck the general under his left eye and killed him. The shot fired by the Confederate marksman was from nearly a half a mile away. When the battle ended, the Union Army had sustained 18,000 casualties out of 100,000 men. The Confederate Army suffered 10,000 casualties from a force of 50,000 soldiers. General Lee saw the urgency in stopping Grant and pushed his troops to thwart the Union move. Lee stated to one of his officers,
"We must destroy this army of Grant's before it gets to the James River. If it gets there, it'll become a siege, and then it'll be a mere question of time."
On June 3rd, 1864, the Confederate Army slaughtered Federal troops at the Battle of Cold Harbor. Grant's army totaled 109,000 men against 59,000 Confederates. The Federal Army attempted several frontal assaults, but was repulsed each time. By noon, the Federal Army had suffered 7,000 casualties, compared to less than 1,500 losses by the Confederates. General Grant said,
"I regret this assault more than any one I have ever ordered."
Though in 1 month's time Grant's army suffered 50,000 casualties, he would not relent in pushing toward Richmond. He sent word to Washington,
"I will take no backward steps. I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer."
Confederate General James Longstreet summed up Grant's determination by stating,
"That man will fight us every day and every hour till the end of the war."
On June 12th, under the cover of darkness, the Federal Army slipped out of the trenches at Cold Harbor and marched south toward Petersburg, Virginia. Though Grant's army had an opportunity to take Petersburg, Confederate reinforcements arrived in time to stop them. Grant settled in for a siege of Petersburg that would ultimately last until the spring of 1865. The siege of Petersburg turned into trench warfare. Extensive trenches, siege batteries, and bomb-proof shelters were built, and artillery and mortar bombardment was the mode of battle. The largest Federal piece of artillery used in the Petersburg siege was called the Dictator. This large gun weighed 17,000 pounds and had to be moved by rail line into position. The shells fired by this gun weighed 200 pounds and could travel over 2.5 miles. While the War of Attrition went on in the East, actions in the Western theater would bring about the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. After General Grant's promotion to commander of all federal forces, General William T. Sherman was promoted to command the Union armies in the West. General Sherman began an offensive against the Confederates in an attempt to capture Atlanta. Sherman's army pushed toward Atlanta, with the Confederates retreating slowly toward that city. The Federal troops continued to press south, and Sherman finally reached the outskirts of Atlanta. The city of Atlanta stood as a symbol of resistance to the Federal push into the South. General Sherman's troops settled in for a siege and captured Atlanta on September 1, 1864. Sherman sent a telegram to President Lincoln, which said,
"Atlanta is ours and fairly won."
During the siege, Sherman's soldiers destroyed railroad tracks to disrupt the flow of supplies. The soldiers would heat the rails and then bend them around trees. These were called Sherman neckties. There was a total of 60,000 casualties suffered by both sides during the Atlanta campaign. As a result of this victory, the political climate in the North drastically changed. The United States of America was preparing to hold a presidential election in the midst of a civil war, something never before attempted. Prior to the fall of Atlanta, President Lincoln's hopes of re-election were dismal. His opponent in the election was former General George B. McClellan. However, God was not finished using Abraham Lincoln, and he won the election on November 8, 1864, with 90% of the electoral votes. After taking Atlanta, General Sherman began his famous March to the Sea on November 15, 1864. As his troops left the city, they torched Atlanta. His army marched unopposed through Georgia, leaving a trail of devastation 60 miles wide and living off the land. Sherman said,
"I can make this march and make Georgia howl."
After Sherman marched through Georgia, he captured the city of Savannah on December 21, 1864. He sent the following telegram to President Lincoln.
"I beg to present to you, as a Christmas gift, the city of Savannah."
The year 1864 closed with the North and South foreseeing a possible end to the conflict. For the North, victory was now a distinct possibility. The Confederates had been soundly defeated in the West and were on the verge of crumbling in the East. As federal armies conquered large tracts of Southern territory, the slaves located in these areas were freed. This year was filled with a series of bloody battles across America where thousands of soldiers perished. The South was torn by war and in despair, and the North's opinion of freeing slaves was beginning to change. God's hand was working to change the hearts of Americans. During the war, Reverend T.V. Moore summed up God's purposes in allowing this conflict.
That war is an evil, and often a sore and terrible evil, is a thing at variance with the spirit of the gospel, is what no Christian can for a moment doubt. But these facts do not place it beyond the employment of God, as a means of working out his purposes on earth. He may also use war to effect his designs among nations.